Joining the Jerusalem Press Club today is retired Brigadier General Mike Herzog, who played a key role in the Arab-Israeli peace process, participating in most of Israel's negotiations with the Syrians, the Jordanians, and the Palestinians. He is an Israel-based international fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and has been active in geopolitical issues in the region, including through Israel's defense ministry. Thank you for being with us during the holiday period, General Herzog.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
So let's just take it one step at a time, beginning with what we actually know is true, that there has been progress on the Israeli-Lebanese front. What should we expect from these upcoming talks?
Yes, as you noted, it was recently announced that there is a breakthrough and that both parties are willing to move ahead and ultimately sign a memorandum of understanding on the division of the disputed area in the sea between Israel and Lebanon, so that as to enable the beginning of drilling in that area. There's long been a dispute between Israel and Lebanon on this, and I'm aware of mediation efforts, US mediation efforts for years now, perhaps over a decade. Basically, the question is, how exactly do you demarcate or delineate your maritime border? There's more than one way of doing it. The question is it 90 degrees to the coastline, or is it a direct continuum of the land border between Israel and Lebanon? And that created kind of a triangle of about 860 square kilometers, which is disputed. As I understand, for a long time, there's not been a breakthrough because the Hezbollah, which is the strongest party in Lebanon and has a veto power in the Lebanese government, would not greenlight the Lebanese government to move ahead on this. But now, under pressure, they agreed, and there is a kind of a formula which is proposed by the US administration, whereby this triangle will be divided, not 50-50, possibly I would say 58 to 60% would go to Lebanon and the rest to Israel, and Israel agreed to that formula. Now, why did Hezbollah change its position and greenlight the Lebanese government to move ahead on this? I think the answer should be found in the unprecedented crisis that Lebanon is undergoing today. Generally speaking, Lebanon is a failed state and its economy is melting down. Nothing functions in that state. They have a ratio of debt to GDP of over 170%, which amounts to nearly $100 billion. They cannot pay their debts. Nothing is functioning in that country. There's no electricity. They can't collect the garbage. We've seen demonstrations, and on top of that, you have COVID, and on top of that, we had the blast in Beirut. And a lot of accusing fingers are now pointed at Hezbollah because they are part of the government, because they serve also an Iranian agenda. We've seen demonstration, we've seen criticism even from within the Shiite community. And I think they ultimately understood that they cannot continue to resist such a settlement. Again, it's a technical settlement. It's not normalization. It's not peace between Israel and Lebanon, but it's something that's supposed to enable both parties to start drilling in that area. And for Lebanon, given the economic meltdown, this is hugely important. So I expect that after the holidays here in Israel, talks will begin, and I think there is a fair chance that finally, after so many years, the parties will sign an MOU and move ahead.
You touched briefly on the internal issues in Lebanon. Over here in Israel, contrary to the other agreements that Israel made over the last few months, the this current negotiation has been made public and the Israeli public is aware. Do you believe that the government needs any sort of consensus, whether it's from the public or internally from its own government or other or the opposition? Will we hear any opposition over the agreement?
I don't expect much opposition. I think this is not a contested issue. It's not the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's something that I think makes sense, and I believe it will enjoy support. It is also something that contributes to stability along the Israeli-Lebanese border. I believe it would have a restraining effect on Hezbollah. There is tension between Israel and Hezbollah. We've seen several attempts by Hezbollah in recent months to take limited action against the IDF along the Israel-Lebanon border. It has to do with the equation they set, whereby if one of their combatants is killed by Israel, they will try and kill an Israeli soldier, kind of one-to-one. And since Israel took action against an Iranian target in the vicinity of Damascus airport a few months back, and one of Hezbollah's people was killed there, then Nasrallah vowed that they will take revenge, and they tried several times and they failed. However, I don't think there's appetite within Hezbollah for a major escalation with Israel. They are under unprecedented pressure. They are at a very low point. The fact that there is a campaign of pressure on Iran cannot support them as it used to. The sanctions on Hezbollah itself, the meltdown in Lebanon, sanctions on Syria, the demonstrations, the blast in Beirut, have all taken a toll. And I think Hezbollah has no appetite now for escalation. But if we sign an agreement about the maritime border, I think that will add another restraining effect on additional restraining effect on Hezbollah. And if, for example, things escalate, I think that this might deter them from targeting Israeli gas installations offshore because of such an agreement. So I believe it's in Israel's interest and would probably enjoy a lot of support here.
Okay, you've explained why Hezbollah wouldn't have an interest in opposing. Would any other Iranian proxies perhaps show their strength and their opposition?
I don't think so. I think this is something that is in the hands of Hezbollah, probably with the consent of the Iranians. And I believe that if Hezbollah gives the green light, then others will follow. And again, it's not normalization. It's a technical agreement on demarcating the border.
Right. In the past, Lebanon would have required a green light even from Assad's regime. Is this still the case today?
I don't think so. It's not. I don't think Syria has that leverage over Lebanon or Hezbollah. Hezbollah answers to first and foremost to Iran, and Assad depends on Iran in more than one way. So I don't think they have the same impact. Syria itself is under tremendous pressure, both internal strife and the pressure of US sanctions. And I think they understand that Lebanon had no choice but to go to this agreement.
All right. And if we look at some other players in the immediate region, what do you believe are Turkey's interests, specifically in the area of the water?
Turkey is a highly problematic actor and becoming increasingly so. Because of its ambitions. Some call it Ottoman ambitions, and I think it makes sense to term it that way. If you listen carefully to Erdogan, he speaks about areas where the Ottoman Empire, which the Ottoman Empire controlled in the past. They have ambitions in Syria and Iraq. He recently spoke about Jerusalem, where the Ottomans been for many years. And he tries to translate his ambitions in a way that is highly problematic for major regional actors. We see Turkey active in Syria militarily. We see the Turkish army acting in Iraq, sorry. We see them in Libya. We see them elsewhere, and most of all in the Mediterranean, where they have some energy ambitions and claims, and it's under a concept they call the Blue Homeland. And they recently signed an agreement with the UN-backed government in Libya about their maritime borders, which of course undercuts Greek interests. And in response, Greek and Egypt signed an agreement, and there is a what's called East Mediterranean Gas Forum, which is headed by Cairo, in which Israel is a member, along with Greece, with Cyprus, with Italy, and some others, and which deliberately, I believe, excludes Turkey. So, and the Turks are sending ships to drill in the Mediterranean. And they are, because of that and for other policies that are becoming a very big headache for regional actors. They are big supporters of Islamists, Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas in Gaza, and others. They basically formed an axis with Qatar, which supports Islamists across the region. They are problematic in many ways. That is why when Israel normalizes relations with some Arab countries, and we talk about a strategic agenda for the Middle East, while for Israel, the number one item on the agenda is Iran, for some major actors in the region, no less important is Turkey on that agenda. Now, Israel doesn't regard Turkey as an enemy, of course, but we are part of the East Mediterranean Gas Forum, and we are well aware of the Turkish challenge.
Understood. Let's move on to the next item. Are rumors of talks between Damascus and Jerusalem just rumors?
These rumors emanated from an article in Saudi newspaper Sharq al-Awsat, pointing out that the Assad regime hardly criticized the Israeli-Arab normalization deals, and speculating that maybe the Syrians would like to kind of open a channel of communication with Israel, thereby relaxing US sanctions. But I think this is speculation. It is true that Syria was kind of moot in its response to the Arab-Israeli normalization, but I think the reason lies elsewhere. It has to do with the fact that Assad has been trying to get back to the Arab fold. And the first Arab country that reopened an embassy in Damascus was the UAE. So I think Assad has his own reasons why he's not coming out against it, and he has other things on his agenda. But to think that it's a realistic scenario whereby Syria will start talks with Israel and the US will ease sanctions, I don't think this is realistic. The crux of the matter is the very strong cooperation between Assad and Iran. That presents a challenge to Israel. That presents a problem to the United States. And as long as this goes on, I do not see a scenario where this US administration will ease sanctions on Syria.
Understood. So We talked a little bit about the normalization agreements with the UAE and Bahrain. So you don't believe that those will make progress between Israel and her immediate neighbors possible anytime soon. But which other countries would you see entering the diplomatic field soon?
Well, President Trump mentioned 5, 6, 7, even 9 countries, but I think by and large we know who are the major candidates. The more immediate candidates are Sudan and Oman, but I think it might take time. I believe that ultimately more countries will follow, but probably not as fast as some people, present it. With Sudan, there's willingness on their part, but some strangers are attached because Sudan would like, first of all, there is still a dialogue between the military part of their regime and the civilian part. The civilians are more reserved. Secondly, Sudan would like the US administration to get it off the list of state sponsors of terror. They are willing to pay victims, but at the same time, they demand the US to provide a package of international economic assistance, $2-3 billion. They are willing to pay victims of terror activities $335 million. And that is under debate now. I don't think the US is willing to provide such a sum, probably less than that. On top of that, Sudan demands that once they pay compensation to the victim of terror acts, the road will be blocked for additional legal action against them, especially by victims of 9/11. We want to make sure that once they pay, the file is closed and there are no additional legal claims against them. And this is a matter of contention in the US, and some senators oppose it, and it's still an open issue. So taken together, there are still complications on the way to Israel-Sudan normalization. Oman is also reserved because, first of all, there's a new leader there, and is now more focused on kind of internal issues and nominations and so on and so forth. But on top of that, I think Oman is also careful because it would like to maintain its semi-neutral position as an actor that can go between Israelis and Palestinians, American and Iranians, and so on and so forth. So it might take some more time. The big prize, of course, is Saudi Arabia, and there's a lot of speculation there as well. I think in the Saudi case, first of all, we've seen Saudi positive attitude towards Israeli-Arab normalization. They allowed for overflights, Israeli overflights. They spoke about it positively. And I think the general attitude is positive. However, Saudi leadership has taken a more of a traditional conservative attitude, sticking by the so-called Arab Peace Initiative, which set some conditions for breakthrough between Israelis and Palestinians. So they are not rushing anywhere. I believe that as long as King Salman is there and he upholds this traditional view, Saudi Arabia will not rush forward to normalization. If MBS becomes the king, it may be a different story. But what you may see in between is not full normalization, but kind of steps towards normalization, somewhere in between, in the gray area, like the overflights they allowed. So you may possibly see more of that. Another country that was mentioned is Morocco, but I think Morocco is right now not seriously considering, even though there have been below the radar relations between Morocco and Israel for many years. But they, for their own domestic reasons, I don't think they are likely to join in the near future. They would also like the United States to recognize their control of Western Sahara, which is a complicated matter. And then there were other countries mentioned like Djibouti, Mauritania, the Comoro Islands, and so on. Maybe, I don't know. Uh, Generally speaking, bottom line, I believe others will follow, but it's going to be a slow, long process.
Very clear. Thank you. Let's move on to the United States. Do you think that a win for Joe Biden in November would impact these trends, increase them, decrease them?
Probably yes. I don't speculate on Biden's policies on many of these issues, but talking to the foreign policy team there, I sense that there are going to be some, potentially significant changes from Trump's policies. I would make 2 points here where I feel more confident. The rest is more speculation. First, as pertains to Iran, it is a stated policy of Biden that he would like to go back, to take the US back to the JCPOA, unlike Trump, and do away with this campaign of maximum pressure. The big question is, under what terms will a Biden administration go back to the JCPOA under the original terms of the deal, or will it try to use the leverage built by the Trump administration in order to improve the deal? I mean, the Biden people acknowledge that there are flaws in the deal and they should be addressed, but the question is how to do it. Right now, the thinking there is that the first thing to do is to get both parties back into compliance, namely Iran will comply with all its commitments under JCPOA, and then the US will lift sanctions. And then based on that, the US will start negotiations with Iran in order to improve the deal. The big question is what leverage will the US have then if it first, lifts sanctions and so on? It's a matter of big policy debate in the US, and I leave it open. Second area where I point out, I believe that the Biden administration would definitely support Israeli-Arab normalization and try to expand it and so on. But I think they will put more emphasis, more than the Trump administration, on trying to use it in order to open space also in the Israeli-Palestinian context, namely to use it not as a bypass, but as a bridge. And that, I think, is something that we should expect if Biden is elected.
If you're already speaking with members of his foreign policy team, perhaps you could enlighten us maybe on a few more specifics about what kinds of things we should be expecting on that end, on the Palestinian front.
Well, it's complicated in the sense that Palestinians, of course, reject any Arab-Israeli normalization because it essentially takes from them the veto power they've had for many, many years, and which was enshrined in the Arab Peace Initiative. But the question is, I personally believe that these new relations between Israel and the region could also open space for Israelis and Palestinians, could legitimize some move on both parties. The fact is that while the Palestinian issue is not as prioritized in the Arab world as it used to be, it still resonates. It still plays a role. And the fact is that the UAE finds it important to say that they managed to block Israeli annexation by normalizing with Israel. How exactly that energy, that potential will be translated into opening space in the Israeli-Palestinian context remains to be seen. It is certainly not going to be easy if the Palestinians don't want a bridge built towards them. If they reject it and continue to look at it as absolutely negative with no potential for them, then definitely it's going to be more difficult to do it. But the potential is there. And as I understand it, it might be there might be an attempt by Biden administration to make use of that potential.
You spoke about the potential in change of policy when it came to leadership change in Saudi Arabia one day. Do you see this also being possible on the Palestinian front? We spoke for many years of the day after Abbas, and at some point we'll have to resuscitate those conversations about the day after Abbas. Do you believe that a different leadership might view things differently, might learn from the last few months in terms of the way things are moving in the Middle East?
Possibly, yes. Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen, as we call him, is 85 years old. Obviously, is closer to the end of his career than to the beginning. I don't know how long he's going to be there, but everybody around him are already positioning themselves towards the day after. I hear a lot of criticism, in the Palestinian political circles that essentially the Palestinian leadership is clueless in the face of this new trend in the region to normalize with Israel. They have no response. They resort back to their old traditional talking points, which we've heard for many, many years. They do not re-engage with the U.S. administration. They don't come up with any creative ideas. They are trying to get closer. Their response is trying to get closer, first of all, to broker reconciliation with Hamas and to get closer to the Turkey-Qatar axis. We've seen Fatah and Hamas conduct reconciliation talks in Istanbul. The PA is asking Qatar for financial support. By the way, there are huge sums of money, which is Palestinian money, which Israel collects on their behalf, tax revenues, and they refuse to take it. And they took that decision when annexation was on the table. It was their response to annexation. But now that annexation is off the table, definitely for years now, they haven't changed that decision. So I think they're just stuck and they're frozen, and they have no real response to the new situation. And potentially a different, different leadership. And I'm not going to speculate who is going to be the next leader there. Could maneuver in such a situation in a better way, and not all of them, but some of them. And I happen to know all of them for many years of negotiation.
All right, General Herzog, we actually have one more question for you that's come in, more relevant to the beginning of our conversation. But I just will take this opportunity to remind our listeners that next Monday we have a conversation with Dr. Khalil Shikaki on Palestinian public opinion. So you will receive invitations for that event in the next few days. But I would like to ask you one more question if you still have time. That has to do with the maritime issue that somebody sent in, specifically regarding Russia, that we haven't heard from recently. Do you think this movement between Israel and Lebanon, the issues that you talked about with Turkey, is there an opportunity here for Russia to try to reestablish its hold of the region, perhaps through the sea?
Well, I think it's a long shot. Russia is very much interested in gas deposits in the Mediterranean, and of course, if there is export of gas from the Mediterranean to Europe, it may kind of weaken European dependence on Russian gas, but I don't think the amounts are such that make such a big difference to Russia. I would mention, however, that when we talk about gas fields, offshore fields, on the Lebanese coast. There is a consortium of 3 companies that's supposed to drill there, and one of them is a Russian company, Lukoil. So I believe that in this specific case, Russia has an interest in an Israeli-Lebanese agreement on drilling there.
Understood. Brigadier General, retired Mike Herzog. You've given us a lot to think about over the rest of the holiday period. Thank you for joining.
Thank you very much.